Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to Maritime Matters. My name's Richard Dunley. I'm joined by my co-host Jennifer Parker. We're recording on Wednesday, the 29th of October, 2025. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we unpack the key developments that have been shaping maritime security in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. As you may know, regular listeners certainly will know that we have been very remiss for, we've now taken well over a month out of what was supposed to be originally a weekly and then a fortnightly podcast. So we do apologise for this. I'm sure we do have excellent justifications that we're definitely not going to bore you with. But we are now back. And hopefully we'll be back on a reasonably regular drumbeat. As ever, as I say, we're recording on the 29th of October. So if something massive happens in the next day or so before we manage to get it out, that's why we don't cover it. So Jen, what have you been up to over the past few weeks?
Not doing Maritime Matters. But thank you for putting out the apologies, and I share the apologies. What have I been? Well, it's not even a few weeks. It's like a month and a half, but I won't bore you with all that. I have been in Indo-PACOM. I've also been in Beijing at the Australia-China High-Level Dialogue, which was fascinating. Lots of discussions around Task Group 107, China's naval task group that circumnavigated Australia this year, and also around these unsafe, unprofessional actions or interactions between Chinese assets and Australian assets in South China Sea, which we'll get into because there has been one in the last 2 weeks. I did do a Deutsche Welle, oddly, so a German national broadcaster special on chokepoints, maritime chokepoints, where I talked about the Malacca Strait, China's Malacca dilemma. So we'll share a link to that if you're interested in discussions around maritime chokepoints. I had an article out in the Fin Review last week talking about the latest interaction between one of our P-8s, Australia's P-8s in South China Sea, which had flares fired too close to it, this time by an Su-35 from the People's Liberation Army Air Force. So I was talking about that and really how, because this is, I guess, increasingly being released to the public, I think there's a concern that the public could become desensitized to it. And I think in some of the reporting, some of the gravity was lost on it in terms of, this stuff could result in an engine shutting down, an engine fire could actually result in a significant accident. So it still needs to be taken with the gravity of these kind of activities. So that's what my article really talks about. Who knows when we're getting this podcast out, but airing tonight, we're recording this on Wednesday, 29th of October. There is a special on Channel 10 where I'm sitting down with Hugh Remington to talk about whether Australia is ready for war. And in fact, is a war likely? What's our strategy? What are our capabilities? Where are the gaps? So I'll be going through that. And then finally, I think we'll talk about this a little bit more, getting ready for Indo-PAC next week. So for those of you that are not in Australia, or are in Australia and not interested in Indo-PAC, Indo-PAC is a 2-yearly conference run by the AMDA Foundation and the Royal Australian Navy. It's a massive trade show, but also, I guess, academic discussion through the Sea Power Conference on all things maritime strategy and capability. And as part of that, Richard, I, and a group of people from the UNSW Naval Studies Group will be launching this book, which I don't know I'm holding out because I'm sure you can't properly see it, but it's called A Maritime Strategy for Australia. And it talks about how do we take some of the recent kind of bent of the Defence Strategic Review and the National Defence Strategy that have kind of lent into the idea of a maritime strategy and some of the investments in Australia's integrated investment program and turn it into a more robust maritime strategy. So that'll be available next week. Richard, I've spoken too long. What have you been up to?
I've not been managing to be anything like as productive as you have, but I have been trying to do some writing. I've been trying to do some academic kind of writing. So at some stage, hopefully some of this stuff might come out, talking about things like sea control and the relationship between sea power and information warfare. But I'm the other thing that I was doing a couple of weeks ago, I was in Hanoi as part of a delegation, as part of a Track 1.5 discussion, which was really interesting. So really enjoyed that, getting a perspective from Vietnam on a lot of the challenges and maritime security challenges facing the region. So that was great. Really enjoyed that.
Now, speaking of, I guess, a link to Vietnam, we talked about one of the unsafe, unprofessional incidents that occurred. So on the 19th of October, there was Australian P-8 operating in the South China Sea. The Australian government hasn't released where it was, except to say it was in international airspace. Chinese state media is reporting that it was operating close to the Paracel Islands. Of course, the Paracel Islands being a series of islands, rocks, features over 300 kilometers from China, disputed between Vietnam, China, and in fact, Taiwan. There was a number of battles around the Paracel Islands between China and Vietnam, which is my Vietnam linkage. I've got to get better at these kind of podcast linkings in the 1970s, including 1974, which was the Battle of the Paracel Islands. And since then, China has effectively held control of the Paracel Islands, but they are very much disputed. And in fact, a number of them are not islands. Richard, do you want to talk about this interaction that's happened in the South China Sea?
Yep. So, kind of, you've already outlined, I guess, the key points. Australian P-8 operating in the South China Sea. These are reasonably regular kind of operations. Was approached by an Su-35, which is I guess, Russian-designed but Chinese fighter jet. Initially, this aircraft released a flare reasonably at a reasonably safe distance from the P-8. It then, certainly according to the statement from Defence and the discussions by the Defence Minister Richard Marles, it then moved much closer to the P-8 and then released two more flares very close. We don't have specifics, certainly not from the Australian side, about the precise distances involved, but the Australian government made it very clear that they considered this to be an unsafe and unprofessional action, and they pushed pretty hard on this, and some quite clear signalling in terms of the media side of things. It has also been raised by Anthony Albanese in his meetings recently over the past day or so with high-level Chinese officials. What I think is quite interesting about this one is the degree to which the Chinese response in terms of the narrative has been to push back very strongly against Australian messaging. I think perhaps more strongly, I would suggest, than previously, particularly around the idea. There was a statement about the fact that Australia's actions seriously infringe upon China's sovereignty, and they could be leading to significant incidences, and they urge Australia to immediately cease its infringing and provocative actions. So much more kind of forward-leaning statement. Now, whether or not this is about the precise location in which this interaction took place, or because the Chinese insist it was in Chinese sovereign, a Chinese sort of sovereign area, sovereign airspace. Now, it seems quite clear from the Australian statements that Australia doesn't consider it to be so, which presumably is in line with international law. One very much assume that. But it does seem that there is something, whether or not the Chinese government are just ratcheting up the pressure on this, or whether this was occurred in something that was seen to be a slightly more sensitive area, is a bit difficult to tell. But it does fit in line with a number of other incidents. There was one earlier on this year in which I think an aircraft released chaff rather than flares. But there have been a number of interactions with Australian P-8s. The other thing which I think is, again, interesting is the timing of this around the discussions of AUKUS and whether or not there's any kind of connection there. It's always difficult to tell, but it certainly it fits into a narrative in which China is seeking to put pressure on Australia in terms of its then broader relations with the United States. What are your thoughts? You've obviously been talking about this quite extensively in the media and in op-eds.
Yeah, look, I guess on the timing, you're right. It occurred as the Prime Minister of Australia, Anthony Albanese, was heading to the States. I think the timing is actually a coincidence, to be honest. I mean, I think that these things happen semi-frequently, is my personal view. I don't know this, but I think that when they reach a certain threshold is when the Australian government chooses to release it to the public. In the way that the Defence Minister described it at the time, that, we often see Chinese fighter aircraft coming up next to our P-8s and deploying flares, indicates that I'm probably fairly correct on that. And I think that this is part of this ongoing harassment of Australian assets, tailing and harassment of Australian assets in the South China Sea. I think that harassment reaches a certain threshold where it probably gets closer to some of the areas that China claims and, of course, aren't recognised by Australia and most countries under international law, is kind of my hypothesis. But I don't think it was timed to the US. I do think I agree with you. China's statement on this is more robust than previously. So on a number of these, China hasn't released a statement. On this one, it was incredibly robust. But I think this is part of what I think is a growing sentiment from the Chinese government. So I mentioned that I was lucky enough to go to China recently, representing the National Security College as part of the 1.5. When we say 1.5, by the way, a 1.5 track just means a conference that involves government and academia or think tank or industries. This was a real key topic, and actually the day that we landed in China, there was an article out in either the China People's Daily or one of the state media anyway that talked about Australia being two-faced. So being very focused on the economic and diplomatic relationship, which I think has improved markedly, but still doing things that upsets China in a security perspective. And when we say it upsets, I mean China's view is that we should not be operating anywhere near the South China Sea or Northeast Asia at any point. And that was a view that was very clearly put to me. So I think as part of this broader thing of now that the relationship is better in the diplomatic and economic sense, that China is now feeling that they can apply pressure on Australia in the security sense. And so I think this is why we're seeing these stronger statements and this kind of, it was an op-ed in a paper, but a state-run paper. So I think it's some clear messaging about this view that Australia may be two-faced. I think, and look, there have been some questions in Australia, and it is very important that Australia does conduct operations patrols in the South China Sea. I mean, the South China Sea is vital to Australia's economic prosperity and security. We've been doing this for decades, longer than decades. Because of the fact that it is important to us. And if you think about the fact that 2/3 of Australia's maritime trade goes through this area. So look, I don't think that this is going to change anytime soon. Australia has diplomatically represented this. I think that these incidents are going to occur for the near term. Any comments, any disagreements?
No, I think you're absolutely right. I just it's always trying to read a little bit between the lines and read the tea leaves with some of these sorts of things. But in terms of the broad thrust, I think, I can't see anything changing. And it's always slightly difficult to tell the degree to which any of these actions are kind of calibrated, or whether actually this is a broader kind of pattern of behaviour. But yeah. What else has been going on in terms of regional sort of development?
Look, there's one worth mentioning. So there was unfortunately a US accident. So the USS Nimitz has been operating in the South China Sea. I'm not sure exactly where, to be honest. The South China Sea is a very broad area. But within 30 minutes, they had a 60 Romeo ditch. Thankfully, all of the aircrew recovered. And then they lost an FA-18 Super Hornet. I've heard lots of kind of conspiracy theorists comments around this on social media. I don't pay too much mind to any of them, to be honest, except to say, and I don't mean to diminish it, thankfully no one was injured. These things do happen from time to time with US aircraft carriers. Of course, they will need to investigate and get to the bottom of it. But I don't think that you can draw any conclusions with respect to the broader tensions that have been happening in the South China Sea, or link it to the P-8 incident that we were just talking about. These are completely different and separate issues.
So you're not a fan of the Bermuda Triangle morphed into the South China Sea type of theories that have been floating around?
I am not. I'm also skeptical on there was a theory I saw that it was fuel contamination. I am also highly skeptical on that. So skeptical on many, except to say it is unfortunate.
In terms of American carriers, there's been quite a lot of attention paid to another deployment of an American carrier. This one is the deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford. This is not directly Indo-Pacific related, but hold on, I'll get there.
It's interesting.
The Ford has been deployed to the Caribbean, and this is very much part of a wider shift in which we've seen a lot of American naval assets deployed into kind of the Caribbean, Latin America more generally. Initially, quite a lot of that was around some of the migrant intercepting migrants and things like this, and you saw the employment of DDGs, Arleigh Burke class destroyers, as part of that. This is a slightly different focus, so I'm sure many of our listeners will have heard and seen about the American I say interceptions, attacks on boats which were suspected of smuggling drugs. And the kind of war of words that's been going on between the United States and particularly President Trump and Venezuela and the Venezuelan leader. And this is, I guess, part of that ramping up of pressure. It's a very, very public and sort of significant statement. Whether or not the Ford or the capabilities as part of the Ford group will actually do anything as part of this, the mere presence of them and the very public announcement of this is quite a significant kind of escalation of those sort of tensions. Coming back to the Indo-Pacific, because I promised I would, I think what is interesting about this is it obviously fits into these wider kind of questions about American focus at the moment. There aren't very many American carrier strike groups, and you mentioned USS Nimitz. She's actually on her last deployment. She's on her way home to get decommissioned. So American carrier strike groups are not particularly common assets, and the deployment of them in this kind of way fits into the wider kind of questions which are ongoing about what is American focus, and particularly around things like questions of the release of the American National Security Strategy, and the degree to which you're going to see a focus on both internal security and security in the kind of the Western Hemisphere versus the questions around the Indo-Pacific more broadly, and particularly kind of the South China Sea and the China question. So I think that there are some really kind of interesting undertones to this. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think there are some interesting undertones to this. I do think to your point, I think it is relevant for the Indo-Pacific. I agree, because there was a question about what is the US's focus? Is it competing with China in the Indo-Pacific, or is it something else? And there have been a lot of rumors this year that the US National Defense Strategy, which is due out, I guess, shortly. I mean, it must be, I would suspect, November now, because Pete Hegseth did announce, a US Secretary of War, Secretary of Defense, did announce early this year that it would be accelerated, which would make sense for a new administration. There are questions around what it might articulate as its priorities. Some of the reporting, I think, from the Financial Times or Politico, says that priority number one, protecting the US homeland; priority number two, US regional issues; priority number three, competing with China. And a lot has been made of that. I actually, if it does say that, I actually don't have a problem with that. I mean, protecting your own national interest should always be your priority number one, your region your priority number two. Where that moves to things like force apportionment, I think is probably a greater concern for Australia. And this is kind of what we're seeing in the Caribbean at the moment. Since the current administration took over, we've actually seen a flood of assets to the Caribbean. So the US does normally operate a destroyer or two in the Caribbean. I actually deployed there about 11 years ago on a UK frigate with the US Coast Guard Ledette doing counter narcotics operations. So the US does normally have forces there chasing drug smugglers. What's different now is the sheer number of forces that have been there since the Trump administration took over, and also how they're choosing to prosecute this. operation. So previously, to be honest, chasing drug smugglers in the Caribbean was a little bit like shooting fish in a barrel. They are everywhere. And to be honest, most days you would have an interception. Now, these vessels that have been blowing up, normally what you would do is you'd get your helicopter up, you'd have a US Coast Guard sniper in it, they would shoot out the engines of the vessel, you'd then board and take the drugs as they're trying to throw them over the side, arrest them, and either take them back to the US mainland or drop them off in a country, depending on their country of origin, bilateral agreements, etc. What's changed is that the US has now decided to blow up 10 of these vessels. So no boarding, no arresting, just blowing them up in international waters, which of course has challenges when it comes to international maritime law. The Trump administration have said that this is a non-international armed conflict and designated them as terrorists. But there are some questions about the nexus there, of course. And I think that is a challenge because when we talk about China's behaviour in the South China Sea, which I would say is not consistent with international law when we talk about the West Philippine Sea, or in fact behaviour towards the Australian P-8, it becomes a more difficult conversation because of these US strikes in the Caribbean. So I think there's that element. There's also this burgeoning conflict between the US and Venezuela, which, two countries that have been at odds really for the better part of this century. For various reasons, and how that might escalate. And again, what that means about the potential for states resorting to use of force to solve their problems. Well, I'm seeing the US president talking about potential land strikes. Now, that's probably talking too much on the Venezuela issue, but to your point, I agree. It directly impacts the Indo-Pacific in terms of priorities and force apportionment, but also about this contestation of international maritime law and these norms around the use of force and how they are potentially evolving. So I think it is certainly a really interesting one. Now, one other one before I guess we go on to capability, which I thought was just a nice, light-hearted one, just to come back down from drug smugglers being blown up in the Caribbean. Young Endeavour. So Young Endeavour has completed the final circumnavigation of Australia. So what is Young Endeavour, you ask? Well, it is a ship that I spent many hours vomiting over the side of going across Bass Strait. Not that you wanted to know that. But Young Endeavour, the Young Endeavour Youth Scheme, so it's a national youth development program run by the Australian government. STS Young Endeavour is a 44-metre tall ship operated by the Royal Australian Navy, commanded by a Royal Australian naval officer, in fact, one of my former navigators. And they have had about 16,000 Australian youth go through Young Endeavour since it was gifted to Australia by the UK in 1988. So, when we talk about Australia as a maritime nation, and Australians, we often criticise Australians when they think of maritime, they think of the beach, and that's about it. This has been something that is very much focused on giving young Australians that maritime experience and either getting them connected with potential careers in the Navy or just potential careers in the maritime industry. So I think it's been a pretty important capability, one that we don't talk about. Now, Young Endeavour has completed her final circumnavigation of Australia. She's still going to be operating into 2020. Her replacement is being built by Burden in Port Macquarie. There are questions about whether her replacement is on track. There's some reporting, not official reporting, but reporting in some of the defence magazines that it's a couple of years late. But we won't delve into this because this was meant to be the uplifting story. So I think it was important to acknowledge Young Endeavour's circumnavigation. We won't talk about any potential delays with Young Endeavour's replacement. We talk about shipbuilding issues enough. Any comments on Young Endeavour before we talk about the good AUKUS news?
No, I love the story of Young Endeavour, and I didn't actually know it was gifted by the UK. So that is...
that should have been our Did You Know?
A learning experience for everyone involved. Excellent. So we can't have too many of these podcasts without talking about AUKUS. So good AUKUS news, broadly speaking. I guess this is something that I'm sure everyone who listens to the podcast is aware of. I don't think you could have lived in Australia and not been aware of. The meeting finally occurred between Prime Minister Albanese and President Trump. And it went, I think, about as well as Anthony Albanese could possibly have expected. including some very positive comments from Trump himself about AUKUS, in his typical kind of off-the-cuff style, about comments like, "Oh no, they're getting them," about questions about whether or not the submarines would be delivered, or Australia would get the SSNs on time. And the idea that we're going full steam ahead in terms of American submarine building, and some exceptionally positive remarks about the construction of American submarines. So very, very positive in many ways in terms of the AUKUS, kind of the broader AUKUS story, and I guess there have been very significant questions over AUKUS more generally ever since ever since Trump's victory in the presidential election, but then they were kind of really ramped up after the leaking of the news of the Pentagon review of AUKUS. And I think a lot of people, lots of people said AUKUS was over and AUKUS was dead, certainly in Australia. But I think there were even those who were much more favourable to AUKUS, had certain concerns about what would come out of this. And I think obviously this is very positive news. I think it's worth flagging that was it John Phelan, the Secretary of the Navy, was consistently trying to get comments in to the Trump narrative, which I guess sort of slight clarifications, and saying about how they were looking to improve AUKUS for all three nations. Now, quite what that means, I think, is still very much unclear. And then there were remarks from Anthony Albanese at a press conference, I think whilst he was still in the US, about the idea of speeding up AUKUS, which again I think is interesting to hear and raises a whole host of questions. But overall, I think good AUKUS news. What's your take? Again, another story about which you've been talking quite a lot.
Yeah, I did a lot of early morning TV on this one. I think that, AUKUS, of course, is ambitious. There are good arguments for and against. I feel like I've said this a lot of time. I'm reading off my script now. Good arguments for and against nuclear-powered submarines for Australia. But either way, we are down the path, and we are, in fact, 4 years down the path. So that kind of horse has really bolted. Look, I guess I didn't share the same doom and gloom about AUKUS when the review was leaked. And I think we talked about at the time, you always got to take into context, why are things leaked? Things are always leaked for a reason, and often to apply pressure. So, I think that I've always said that there's a lot in this deal for the US. The perception that they are gifting a capability to Australia is fundamentally incorrect. And so I thought that any rational thinker, and you can make arguments about rationality, but any rational thinker would see that this is very much in their interest, despite, what are genuine issues in the US submarine industrial base. So I've made that argument many, many times, and I won't bore you all with that argument, but I wasn't surprised. The only caveat was I did think that President Trump not making positive statements about AUKUS until this point was about having leverage. So certainly my view was that his strategy in approaching the NATO summit in June this year was that he would neither confirm nor deny or support Article 5, which is what NATO really wanted, what the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, really wanted, until NATO came to the party on defence spending. So I thought that Trump's failure to really talk about AUKUS in any way, shape, or form that was meaningful this year, despite consistent questions, was about having leverage over Australia until we came to the party on something. Now, I was hopeful that something might be defence spending. Clearly, that something is very much critical minerals and also convincing the US of the work around Henderson and Sterling. I think it's a great diplomatic achievement. So I was a little bit surprised, I think, to see how positive Trump was about AUKUS, because I thought he would just hold off until he got more out of Australia. But either way, I think it's good. Has anything fundamentally changed with AUKUS? No, not really. It's still ambitious. A lot's been achieved. There's still significant risks. And the question for me is, how effectively those risks being mitigated. I would say fairly effectively to date, as we know in the public domain. Of course, I'm sure there's a lot in the private domain that we don't know about that is still significantly challenging. So, look, I think this is positive, absolutely. But I do think that a lot of this, and I think you disagree with me on this point, but I think a lot of this will we, won't we AUKUS conversation this year has kind of been self-generated inertia in Australia, and a lot of it I think relates to our lack of confidence. That's kind of, anyway, I won't go down that path. This is a longer conversation, probably a longer form piece explaining, but I think that we don't believe in ourselves when it comes to these large endeavors. And we have some bad track records when it comes to certain projects, but I think a lot of it came from that insecurity as opposed to the signals that we were getting from the US. I think you disagree with me there.
A little bit. And I think in some ways this is great. I also think in other ways, actually, not a lot has changed by Trump making these kind of statements. And in terms of your point about leverage, I agree with you. I thought that the US was looking to get more out of Australia. I know there has been some discussion. I think, again, you've talked about this, about the question of more formal kind of basing type agreements, and whether or not the US behind the scenes is pushing for something much more solid in terms of basing of assets. Now, that would obviously run up against some very significant Australian political and kind of deeper sort of cultural pressure. So I think that is a space where it might be interesting to keep a little bit of an eye on, because I think that is definitely something where there have been at least rumours that the Americans are keen on getting movement from Australia.
Absolutely. Now, this is me trying to get better at my podcast segues, which suck. On the theme of submarine warfare, what's happened in this space? Now, often, I just want to highlight, often we are accused of talking about maritime, but we're really talking about naval. We are definitely talking about maritime today, and there has been a development in the Royal Australian Air Force. So what is that development, Richard?
So this is the re-establishment of 12 Squadron, based out of Edinburgh in South Australia, which is going to be the second Australian P-8 Squadron. So we've already talked a little bit about P-8s. I guess we should have talked about what P-8s are. P-8s are a maritime patrol aircraft. They primarily are designed for anti-submarine warfare, but more broadly as maritime patrol aircraft. This is going to be, there are now going to be two P-8 squadrons, which are going to be the kind of the core of Australia's, the Australian Air Force, Royal Australian Air Force's kind of maritime focused capability, together with the uncrewed Triton UAVs, which provide kind of very high level of endurance for ISR, so intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capability. So we're now going to end up with a fleet of 14 P-8s spread across two squadrons. So this is, I guess, it's to be expected, but definitely part of the growing capability that the Royal Australian Air Force has in maritime.
All right, so we're going to talk about Singapore. What's happening with Singapore?
So Singapore's been doing some really kind of interesting stuff in terms of their naval capability for a little while now. Partly this is a product of the fact that they're kind of recapitalizing and they're pushing the envelope, but also they're really focused on addressing some of the challenges around things like their limited personnel capability. So they've got relatively few people, but have quite a lot of both requirements, particularly in the maritime security kind of space, but also ambition. So they've been playing with a whole host of interesting bits of technology around things like uncrewed platforms, etc. And as part of this, one of the things that they're doing is they're commissioning 6 what are referred to as multi-role combat vessels. These are pretty large. They're 8,000 tons. They are slightly odd-looking kind of boxy type ships, but they are effectively a cross between something that is a little bit like a frigate with a mothership for uncrewed capability. And so they are really pushing into the UUV, so uncrewed underwater vehicle, uncrewed surface vehicle, USV, and UAV space, and looking to try and use this as a mothership to try and deploy these assets. And it has a number of features designed for this, including things like a load and recovery system for smaller boats. It's got a significant flight deck, but it's also got a really large mission bay, which again helps with the uncrewed platforms, but also means it's very flexible in terms of things like putting on containers that provide capability in terms of HADR, so humanitarian aid and disaster relief, or other types of roles. So it's a highly flexible asset which lets a relatively small navy like the Singaporean Navy be able to cover a whole host of tasks. So really interesting bit of kit. Will be interesting to see how it gets operationalized and gets kind of employed, but it's not going to be commissioned, I think, until 2028.
I think it's interesting as well. Notably, it's replacing their Victory class corvettes, which have been around from the 90s. Anyone that's done any of the FPDA exercises would know the Victory class corvettes very well. But 8,000 tons is quite large. In fact, it's the size of a Hunter. I know we often say the Hunter is 10,000 tons. It is 8,200 tons, is my understanding. But I think it is interesting, right? Often when we talk about naval capability, there is a tradition amongst many navies, not just the Royal Australian Navy, of replacing like for like. The US tried to move away from that recently with the ideas around littoral combat ships and also the Zumwalt destroyer, both of which doesn't go well. And it does take a little bit of bravery to develop a new capability, a new design, and understand how it will operate within your Navy. Look, I think this is interesting, and working out how larger naval platforms can have a role as a mothership for uncrewed capabilities is key. I do think that this is potentially one of the roles for the Hunter class frigate when we get it. Now, we're not getting our Hunters in 2028, 2032, 2034 operational for the first one. But the Hunter class frigate also does have quite a significant mission bay, something like 12 ISO containers in size, something like that. So potentially we can watch how Singapore evolve with this capability, how they're using these in terms of operational concepts, and learn a bit in terms of how we might employ the Hunter potentially in that role, which is a little bit potentially at odds with its more deeper ASW, but also makes it more capable. Do you want to talk, Richard, about this UK Atlantic Bastion?
So I will very briefly talk about this because this one flagged interest for me. The Atlantic Bastion is a concept that came out of the British, and I have to get the description right now. It's their strategic defense review, because everyone uses the same words in different orders to describe their airing reports, which is highly confusing. But basically, it is the Royal Navy looking to respond to the threat of Russian underwater warfare, both in a traditional kind of sense, but also in terms of critical infrastructure. There is also a unsaid, but I think quite widely acknowledged question around the fact that the existing legacy capabilities and platforms that the Royal Navy would traditionally use for this, notably the Type 23 frigates and the Astute class submarines, both have problems. The Type 23s are supposed to be replaced by the Type 26s and have not yet been. And the Astute class have significant operational availability problems. So one of the things that they're looking to do is basically really drive acceleration in terms of getting uncrewed platforms out. And so this was just an announcement of an intention to tender. So basically they were looking for commercial companies who can go out and provide uncrewed platforms operating effectively on a commercial basis, but providing information back to the Royal Navy operating in the North Atlantic. And the things that I think are interesting is, A, the fact that they're looking for commercial providers to do this, and that they're looking for this to be deployed starting in 2026. So you are talking really, really tight kind of timelines. Will it work? Will it not? Who knows? But I thought it was quite an interesting little piece.
Yeah, I think it is interesting on the piece. And I guess, one of the platform intensive roles has been the ASW role in the Greenland Ice and Gap. Often UK frigates are pulled to be the towed array patrol ship. Given that they have a challenge in terms of the amount of surface combatants available to be doing what is effectively an ISR task, I think it's great to see that they're thinking about this in a different way. And in many ways, when you think about the US strategic SIRTAS arrays, which are operated by civilians, is kind of taking that idea, looking if you can do it in an uncrewed fashion. So I think it's interesting. And I also think, too, it just brings our focus back to the idea that anti-submarine warfare is very much a theatre concept that relies heavily on your ISR assets across that theatre. We often think about anti-submarine warfare as a platform-centric concept in terms of, we keep talking about, frigates, MPAs, helicopters, and submarines, but it's actually a theatre concept that brings in all sorts of aspects. Capability-wise, look, there have been a couple of other developments.
Yep, so Strike Master is the Australian kind of project to marry up Naval Strike Missile, which is the Kongsberg Norwegian company, but this is the anti-ship missile that is now being integrated on Australian surface ships, and that there's going to be a factory being built in Newcastle, off the top of my head, to build these things. But this is now being integrated onto a Bushmaster, the Australian-built kind of armoured vehicle, to provide kind of mobile coastal-based anti-ship strike capability. And this is something that's kind of an Australian-focused project, but they conducted one of the first firing tests in Norway about a week ago, which seemingly went very successfully. As I say, it's an Australian project, but it's not the only one of these kind of projects. The US Marine Corps have a naval strike missile on their own vehicle, which is called Nemesis, and that has been deployed, and I think with Australian forces in places like the Philippines as part of Bala-Katan. So it's going to be one of the assets that provides the Australian Army with maritime strike capability, and it's just a kind of another step forward in that.
Yeah, it is, and I think we were making sure that we touched on all aspects of maritime today to make sure we're not accused of just talking about naval issues. Look, I think it's interesting. I wonder if the test firing in Norway is timely. I was looking up a little bit more about Land 8113 Phase 2, which was my understanding. Now, if you're an Army capability geek, happy for you to correct me or call me out. But so at the end of 2024, we did see the Defence Minister and the Defence Industry Minister announce the second long-range fires regiment for Army, which will be equipped with a long-range maritime strike capability. So this is building on the announcement of the HIMARS, 8 of which I think have already been delivered to Australia. I think Australia is getting about 42 for the first regiment. So this second long-range strike regiment, there hasn't been a decision. My understanding is about whether it will operate a Strike Master or whether it will operate HIMARS. And so there are a lot of rumours swirling around that there is a decision pending on that project. And so there has been some stuff earlier in this month about US Congress talking about foreign military sales of additional HIMARS for Australia. And so I wonder if this timing of this firing, which has got a lot of meaning in Australia, is also about influencing this decision on what this second maritime strike regiment for the Army will actually operate. Is there anything else we've missed? We feel like we've tried to wrap up 5 weeks of developments.
I'm sure there's plenty that we've missed, but I think that for the sake of the sanity of our listeners and for ourselves, we're not going to try and cram everything else in, because there has been a lot happening in maritime, as always, right? But I think that you should roll out your Air Force Did You Know?
Right. So, did you know? So we have skipped these a few times. We were called out early in the year, in fact, by an Air Force cadet. So this is for you, because this is an Air Force Did You Know? We talked about the establishment 2 weeks ago, or re-establishment of 12 Squadron. So it got me thinking about what is the history of 12 Squadron. I am not an Air Force historian, but so actually 12 Squadron has a really significant pedigree. So it was formed in February 1939, originally at RAAF Laverton. It was initially equipped with the Hawker Demons and the Avro Anson aircraft. Maritime reconnaissance aircraft, I don't know anything else about them than that, but they were maritime reconnaissance aircraft, which shows the linking to the new 12 Squadron. Actually became the first RAAF squadron to be permanently based in the Northern Territory when it moved to Darwin in mid-1939 as well. So I think that's interesting. What was its focus? Really, during the Second World War, it focused on reconnaissance and shipping escort patrols. It did fight through the Darwin raids of 1942, flying anti-submarine and maritime patrols. Re-equipped in 1943 with some, I'm going to mispronounce, Volti, Vengeance, dive bombers, and the first RAAF squadron in the Southwest Pacific to do so. Transitioned later to the B-24 Liberator heavy bombers, striking Japanese shipping and installations across Timor, Arafura, and Bandar Abbas. Post World War II and in the Cold War, it operated the Avro Lincolns, but then it was redesignated to 1 Squadron RAAF in February 1948. So we saw a gap in 12 Squadron. 12 Squadron was reformed in 1973 at RAAF Amberley to operate Chinooks. And an interesting history note is that the Chinooks that we purchased, which were Chinooks from the Vietnam War, were actually shipped across to Australia on HMAS Melbourne. So it shows the importance of sea lift capability. 12 Squadron operated the Chinooks until 1989, where it disbanded and the Chinooks were transferred to Army, and we saw significant changes in terms of Army operating that helicopter capability. And of course, we now know the 12 Squadron has been reformed as a predominantly a maritime patrol, anti-submarine warfare squadron. And finally, their motto is "We roam, we charge." There you go. Apparently, they've got a bull on their badge. So, everything you needed to know about the new 12 Squadron to show that we are maritime focused.
12 Squadron has a long and distinguished history, particularly in maritime stuff and in the Second World War. So it's great to see it being reformed and that identity coming back again. And they're likely to operate quite a lot in many of the same kind of areas that they did 80 or so years ago. So definitely an interesting one, and it's good to see the kind of the continuity and the drawing on the history within the RAAF.
I agree. Right. So that is the sign that we should wrap this up. Look forward to seeing those that will be there at IndoPack next week. Keep an eye out for this book, which Richard and I have both contributed to, A Maritime Strategy for Australia. Dropping it IndoPack, it will be available online. And just because we're nice, it'll be available online for free from the 4th of November. So thanks, Richard. Great to chat. Always great to chat.
Absolutely. Cheers, Jen.